My name is David Lakeman. I'm the editor of Science and Society. I have no idea whether that's relevant. I was asked to chair this because I've known the speaker for quite a number of years. It's going to be quite a thrill, I think you'll find. I'm going to just take a back seat after this and let him run the question and answer period. He'll talk for about 45-50 minutes. And then we'll go right into questions in order not to waste any time. And I'm sure you'll have plenty of them because there's plenty to ask about his topic. The topic is intriguing: crisis, finance, and fascism. So we'll see how those three study of macroeconomics, which has been and will be reissued also by Routledge in 2012, next year, with the title, The Irrevocable Inconsistency of Neoclassical Macroeconomics, False Paradigm. So he writes in a very profoundly Marxist political economy voice, and he writes in a Central America activist voice, and he also speaks directly to the economics profession. I don't know how he does all this. But it's the interaction of all these facets which makes him quite interesting, and I think you're going to be delighted. By the way, I want to mention one more thing. He's turned into a latter-day blogger. He's discovered the internet. Now, he's known about it for a long time. But anyway, he puts out very, very nice weekly blogs, very serious ones, good, solid ones. And you just have to go to jweeks.org. No www, just jweeks.org, and you can sign up there and get these. It's very worthwhile. I recommend it highly. So without further delay, let me turn everything over to John Weeks.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for inviting me. I was here on last Friday on the 75th anniversary of Science and Society, and it was a great pleasure to be there and now. In the early 1980s, the Washington Post, in its Sunday cartoons, you would have missed it being New Yorkers, had a Uncle Scrooge cartoon. I don't know if you know who Uncle Scrooge is. Some of you do, right? Uncle Scrooge is the world's richest duck, right? And he has a son named Donald. And in this Sunday comic strip, it begins by Donald picks up his pay from MacDuck Enterprises at the pay window. This is old-fashioned. And then he goes out and he gets in his car and he drives to MacDuck service stations and he buys gasoline, and he goes to MacDuck supermarket and he buys groceries. And then he stops off at the MacDuck real estate agency and pays his rent. Then he gets home and he sees his nephews. He says, "I'm out of money." And they say, "Go ask Uncle Scrooge for an advance from next week's salary." So he goes to see his uncle and he says, "Could I have an advance on my salary and spend it all?" And his uncle says, "I don't have any trouble keeping my money." Now that is very deep if you think about it. That's quite a deep cartoon because it captures succinctly Marx's explanation of what capitalism is. What is capitalism? Capital is buying in order to sell. Right? What Marx called MC, M prime, and you end up with more money. But I don't have a blackboard just as well. I can say it. It's easy to understand in words. That's what capitalists do. When you do that, you're a capitalist. Where does the expanded money come from? You buy something, you sell it, you get it for more. Well, we all know where it comes from. It comes from what the rest of us do. And what the rest of us do is we sell in order to buy. And we sell something very specific. We sell our ability to work. So a person goes to work, sells his ability to work, is paid for it, and then buys something. That is intricately related that is, you might say, that is the basis of the expansion of capital. Because what we've done is we've sold our, well, not me, I was an unproductive worker in academia, but there are productive workers in this world. The capitalist advances money, what the capitalist buys, among other things, is people's ability to work. The person works. The person not cheated, gets full wage. But the capitalist gets the output and sells it. And that output has embodied not only a value to replace the wage, but an expanded value. I'm not going to use terminology, but that's just an example of how the term surplus value is not an esoteric term. It's the difference between what the capitalist starts with and what he ends up with. And that comes from the rest of us selling in order to buy. Now, I go into that because that essential, that relatively simple idea, a small minority buying in order to sell, majority selling in order to buy, is of course the basis of the expanding capitalist system. It has a very important implication when you sell something. It means that the thing which is sold has two aspects. Say you buy a book and you read it. Well, it has a use. You bought the book, it has a use, and you paid something for it. So it has a value in exchange and a value in use. I'll give you a good example, a very concrete a very concrete case of that, where to show the fundamental difference between the two. After World War II, an increasing number of Americans bought their own homes. There were various types of mortgage programs for veterans, particularly, that led to the expansion of ownership. Now, you could say that those homes had a market value, which they did, and that they had an exchange value. But in fact, most people bought their homes to live in. Right? You bought it, you paid it off, you lived in it. It was something you were going to use. And you moved when your job changed, you had to move, or a person died and was passed on. Come the 1980s, there's a deregulation of the financial sector. People begin, and wages, real wages, are stagnant. People begin to borrow. Because of the deregulation of the financial sector, it becomes possible to borrow on the value of your house. It wasn't possible to do it before. It wasn't legally possible to do it before. So it becomes legally possible. So you say, well, that's actually great, isn't it? I mean, that people have this asset. I had a progressive comrade say to that, you know, that was a good aspect of deregulation. Most of it was bad, but there was a good aspect of it. People could borrow on their houses. What was happening is the house was becoming an exchange value, a commodity for the person who lived in it too. And the inevitable consequence of that was the subprime crisis and foreclosures and people being thrown out of their homes. I mean, peasants all over the world and farmers all over the world have known this for generations, right? You mortgage your farm when times are good, and the price goes down. Well, that's what homeowners have. Okay, so why do I go into this? I go into this to demonstrate that there is a fundamental contradiction here. Things are for use, things are for exchange. It's not an esoteric, this is not some Hegelian word, contradiction. Straightforward thing. There's value in use, and there's value in exchange. That's also true of people's labor. They were value in use. Their value in use to capital is they can work and produce things. Their value in use to themselves is irrelevant to capital. At any rate, that, somehow that tension must be resolved. And of course the way it's resolved is through money, right? You know, but you have something that's useful, it's going to be sold. A lot of things are going to be sold. So you begin increasingly, you have to have a universal thing to exchange against all these items. And that's money. That's what money is. What is money? Money is the thing that you use to buy and sell things. Okay. This is going someplace. Money then is an abstraction from the book, from the house, from the bottle of beer, from the watch, from a piece of paper. Money is the general representation of exchange or value or wealth in its purest or most abstract form. Okay. Now, we aren't through with the contradictions yet. We aren't through with the abstractions, because as capitalism expands, if you think about it for a moment, a problem arises, a pretty fundamental problem arises to individual capitalists and individual companies. A company is expanding. It wants to build a factory. The factory's going to last for 20 years, let's say. The factory probably is, the cost of building it is probably 5 or 6 times the annual revenue of that firm, much less its profits. So how is it going to expand? And this was a real problem in the early days of capitalism, and that's before you had heavy mechanization, and companies would put on another wing on the factory and hire a few more workers and so on. But by the time you begin to get to the second half of the 19th century, that's no longer sufficient. Well, the obvious solution for that solution is that the company borrows. It borrows on the promise of future profits. Now, this apparently simple act leads then to the creation, we might say, the next level of abstraction, credit. So you might say when you buy and sell things, you actually have, a note. So you buy the book. I know it's a very 20th century, only people of my generation actually pay for anything with money. People of my generation and drug dealers. But credit is a more general representation of money. It's a more abstract form of money. Now, once you have credit, the capitalist class is now divided. It was divided before in a relatively minor way because there were, department stores and retailers and so on. So there was commercial capital. But now we have another division. You get financial capital. Throughout the 19th century, capital, you might say, as productive capital, companies that produce things, were politically dominant over finance capital for the most part. The big financial houses made their money primarily from rather old-fashioned things, lending to governments, speculating on currencies, and so on. But it doesn't look so old-fashioned now. But with the new rising capitalist system, it was the industrial capitalists who were powerful. Until after World War I. And then you began to get the rise of industrialists who became financiers. So this division between financial capital and productive capital is not, a strict division between banks and factories. The Morgans, the Rockefellers, they were also financiers as well as involved in productive activity. It was this creation of finance and separation of finance from production, essentially, that led to the Great Depression. Because you've got an inflation of the ownership claims, so stocks, which on factories and railroads and other concrete things, but it was an inflation that bore no relationship to the intrinsic value of those things. And so after a while, it was a bubble, what we today would call a bubble, but then they called a bubble too. And a shock caused the crash. And a particular shock in that case was the collapse of agriculture. I think it was the collapse of agricultural income in the United States, which was a result of the Great Drought in the 1920s. But anyway, whatever the cause, you had a financial collapse. There was a run on U.S. banks. In 1932 alone, 20% of the banks in the United States disappeared. Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in March 1933. In those days, the inauguration was in March, and it was moved back to January while Roosevelt was president. He was inaugurated. 2 weeks after he was elected, inaugurated, after he gave his inaugural address, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 was passed. The Glass-Steagall Act basic purpose was to return finance to its subordinate position in a capitalist system. To return finance to a situation in which it was the errand boy or errand girl or the servant to industrial capital. That was the purpose of it. And the way that was done was it restricted what banks could do. They could not speculate on the stock market. They could not go into real estate. They could not do many, many things. So basically, the financial sector was constrained. And that continued until 1981, 1982. Of course, you had the war that intervened, but say from 1951, once the war was over and we were beginning to get recovery, for 30 years, there were no bank pegs. There were no financial crises. That doesn't mean there weren't recessions. There were, because there's still fundamental difficulties in the capitalist system arising at the level of production, which I can go into in question and answer period, but I'm not so, that's not so important to my discussion now. There was a recession at the end of Eisenhower's second term, and then in the 1970s, a rise in oil prices led to 2 recessions. I think that those, the 1971s were serious in terms of the downturn, but not terribly serious, I would say, in terms of the capitalist system as a whole, because there were basically oil prices going up, which represented, it was like a tax on production. Okay, and then you have the deregulation of the financial system beginning in 1982. The dismantling of the Glass-Steagall Act. What was being deregulated? What was happening? What the deregulation did is it was liberating finance capital to assert its dominance over industrial capital. Now let me say, I'm not romantic about industrial capital. But it does generate certain countervailing factors, forces, which potentially can lead to progressive change. Namely, the working class. Right? Factories, workers, trade unions may not lead to revolution, but they can lead to, you know, higher wages and particularly in Europe, healthcare system and so on. It's worth looking back before we enter into the consequences of the deregulation. It's worth looking back to see what people were saying after World War II, in the early 1950s. Not only Marxists, not only socialists, but Christian Democrats. A leading Austrian Christian Democrat, the name of R.W. Rostow, he was only a distant relative of the financiers. He was an economist. He was from Austria. He had escaped the Nazis, and he went to the University of Glasgow. And in the Economic Journal, the most prestigious economic journal in the English language then, maybe now, but certainly then, he wrote, "Competition among great financial houses leads to dictatorship and fascism." This is not some crazy Marxist, you know. This is not even, you know, Bloom or Adler. This is a Christian Democrat. There was a consensus at the end of World War II that during the 1920s there was something desperately wrong with the capitalist system and the market system. There was something terribly wrong that had to be corrected because it had, from a progressive point of view, it had led to the terrible scourge of fascism, and from the Christian Democratic point of view, even worse, it had led to two great scourges, fascism and communism. So the Christian Democrats were just as concerned about the dangers of unregulated capitalism as the Social Democrats and the Socialists. I'll quote from Rothschild. Remember, this is published in something equivalent of the American Economic Review. He said, "Fascism has largely come to power by this struggle among financial houses, the attempt of the most powerful oligopolists to strengthen through their political action their position in the labor market and vis-a-vis smaller competitors, and to strike out on the world stage." I think that has some resonance now, and I'll be more explicit about it in a moment. So there arose a consensus that if capitalism was going to be humane, we were going to have a humane market system. The financial system had to be tightly regulated. You had to have trade unions. You had to have the right to organize, and a whole range of controls over activities of business. Not to mention the welfare state, but I'm going to focus on control of capital and markets. That consensus had some very powerful dissenters. And those very powerful dissenters were in finance and industrial capital. And as far as they were concerned, it was only a temporary setback until the situation can be corrected. So I think really, certainly from the 1980s, but even in the 70s, we see the destruction of the post-war regulatory consensus and the liberation of capital from its civilizing tendencies. In economics, I mean, I don't want to bore you with economics, but it's interesting to see there the ideological struggle was most flagrant. because Keynes had provided the analytical underpinnings of social democracy and Christian democracy, really. The argument that governments were responsible for ensuring that you stayed near full employment, that markets were faulty, that speculation was undesirable, and that you needed a indicative management of the economy. Bit by bit in the economics profession, Keynes was discredited. Actually, it began very early, 1944. First article was written by a man who would later get the Nobel Prize, named Modigliani, not the painter, I much prefer the painter, who argued that Keynes' contribution was trivial. It was a special case. Others took this up, but as long as you had, at the political level, a consensus about sort of a liberal or social democratic, Christian democratic consensus, the economics continued to be the economics of Keynes at the policy level through the 1960s. Then the oil price increases brought an unexpected and wonderful opportunity for the forces of reaction, because up until the late 1960s, it was very difficult to argue that the main problem generated by market economies, it was very hard to argue against the view that the main problem was unemployment. Pretty much into the late 1960s, there was a consensus in Western Europe, Japan, the United States, that the main problem in a capitalist economy was staying close to full employment. Unemployment was a major problem. Come the 1970s, you get the price increases from oil. The cause is absolutely crystal clear. I mean, if you just think about it for a moment. And inflation got up to about 15% in the United States. It was a result of petroleum prices going up. Does anybody think that there's any action that the government could have taken to drive down the price of petroleum? No, there wasn't. Because there was a cartel setting the price of petroleum. There were some things you could do at a margin, such as the U.S. strategic oil reserves, but I won't go into that. Essentially, there wasn't anything to do. So therefore, if you were successful in controlling inflation, what would you have controlled? Wages. That's the part of the price increase that you would have prevented to rise. So suddenly, the conjunctural events were providing forces of reaction with a policy story. And their policy story was excessive Keynesian policies, government expenditure, and loose monetary policy has resulted in inflation. And this inflation, far from generating higher profits and more employment, is actually undermining the economy. And the only way we can return to a strong employment situation is by reducing government expenditure, eliminating those deficits, having a tight monetary policy. And a few of you are, well, several of you are too young, but some of you will remember when Reagan came in and they had the head of the Federal Reserve System embarked upon a very severe monetary policy of monetary contraction. That just means making credit much more difficult to obtain, contracted the economy, and generated the worst unemployment since the Great Depression. But it looks fairly benign compared to what we have now. So you would have thought that this would have discredited it. To the contrary, the interpretation given was so bad had been the excesses of expansionary policies, populist policies that came to be called. So bad was it that it was necessary to go through this very painful period to overcome it and to deregulate the financial sector in order to take advantage of, bring down interest rates and to increase efficiency in the economy. So as a result, the very sensible idea that the role of governments is to ensure that the market system, and as far as they can ensure it, is to try to encourage the market system, manage the market system, so it's for the welfare of the population through a number of instruments, became discredited in favor of the view that markets would produce in it themselves desirable outcomes. What does that have to do with financial capital? Because I began with the discussion of the development of financial capital. What does that do with financial capital is this is exactly the type of policy which financial interests thrive upon. High interest rates, reduction in government expenditure, because the way the financial sector obtains profits is through a redistribution from productive sectors. So getting taxes down, in a way, is essential to their project, if you think about it for a minute, because taxes come out of industrial profits too. So there's a direct conflict between the expansion of the financial sector and government taxation. Our government's taxation, if I can say it this time. I find that the extent to which the reactionary narrative has become successful is that people talk about taxes as a burden. I mean, isn't that an extraordinary thing when you reflect on it? This is, governments are created, they may be terrible, they may be good, whatever. Governments exist because we live in a society. Individuals cannot regulate themselves. I mean, there are things that societies require. That's why we have governments. Hobbes was a lot better on this than Adam Smith was. Okay, so what are the taxes? The taxes are what we pay to ensure that crass individualism doesn't break out and that greed doesn't rule in the market system. That's why we pay taxes. Even more absurd. I remember that reading in the British press in a debate over funding universities. They said, the burden of funding universities should be reduced. The burden on the taxpayer funding universities. And I want to say, has anybody been to a hospital lately? How do they think that those doctors got educated? Do you send your children to school? I don't think the school teachers got educated. But I'm wandering off my point, because the point I want to make is that since 1980, we've had a history of, or a narrative of, decommissioning economic policies. Take first fiscal policy. What should government's fiscal policy do? It's quite clear. Read the Full Employment Act of 1945. Some of you may have heard of the Full Employment Act of 1945. States that it is the responsibility of the government to maintain the economy near full employment and to sustain the welfare of the population. those, in fact, the instructions to the Federal Reserve System of what it's supposed to do says nothing about controlling inflation. It says maintain the economy near full employment and protect the purchasing power of the American people. But the full employment one is what's listed first and what's stressed. Okay, so increasingly we got the decommissioning of fiscal policy on two arguments. One was the market economy will generate full employment on its own. Competitive markets will generate employment for everyone that wants to work. So we don't need intervention by government. It's counterproductive. It'll generate inflation, just like it did in the 1970s. So it's unnecessary. And it is counterproductive in that when the government spends, it reduces what the private sector spends. I mean, in a way that if you swallow the first lie, you have to swallow the second one. If it is true that the private economy will generate full employment, then we're at full employment. And therefore, if the government spends more, people in the private economy have to spend less. So it's just a restatement of the original position. So now we've come to a position where a Democratic president, well, Clinton too, but a Democratic president is making part of his re-election promise to reduce the deficit. And in the jobs bill, a very brief digression, there is a very dangerous proposal from Obama. It might be the only one that the Republican Congress will take up. And that proposal is to reduce what he calls payroll taxes. Well, if you want to know what payroll taxes are, that's another way of saying how Social Security is funded. That's very much part of the right-wing agenda. So I think it's extremely dangerous proposal. It's one that will come back, I'm sure it'll come back to haunt him, but worse still, it'll come back to haunt us. Okay. So fiscal policy, you shouldn't do anything because the private economy will take care of itself. And with regard to monetary policy, that is something for experts, right? About which the public should stay out of, or it will just provoke populist policies. I mean, think about it for a moment. We have a private economy that is efficient, it gives you what you want. You are knowledgeable, rational consumers. You can go out and decide which healthcare policy you want. I love healthcare policies. You are insightful and knowledgeable enough to have an idea of what diseases you're likely to catch and what you're likely to die of and when you're likely to die. So therefore, there are different healthcare programs. You can choose among them in a rational way. You can decide which automobile to buy, which one's safe, which speed you want, and so on. You can make many, many sophisticated decisions in the market, and that's why we shouldn't intervene in the market. Except there's one you can't make. You're too ignorant to understand economic policy. You must leave that to experts. We cannot afford to have a bunch of populist pandering to the ignorant desires of the masses, even though they're intelligent enough to do everything else. So where are we left? Well, I'll tell you where we're left very close to. We're left very close to a situation in which none of the major issues, economic issues, will be debated, in which we make a choice. And that's why people occupying Wall Street and the Occupy Wall Street movement are so important, because it gives a hint of what we might be able to do. And this, there are two posters I must mention to you that I particularly like. One is, said, we demand aggregate demand. And perhaps from my lecture you can see the importance of that. I went up there and I saw your Keynesian suggestion on Keynesian. And the other one, I fear, is more likely to be fulfilled, or more, even more accurate. It said, if voting made any difference, it would be illegal. And that leads me to wind up. What is the alternative to this Hobbesian world of the market? What would a main capitalism look like? Well, I happen to think that you could have a humane capitalism. I think that it has actually been realized in some countries, not perfect, but it's pretty clear what is required. One is active, purposeful, macroeconomic policy to maintain full employment. That's one. Nationalization of the financial sector. I think that that's absolutely obvious. Wouldn't have to be government ownership. It could be mutual funds, you know, like the like we used to have in the housing market. In short, that the financial sector would no longer be profit making. I would say a guaranteed minimum income so that the labor market would no longer be competitive. That is one of the most debilitating aspects of the market system is unemployment and being unemployed and the weakness of labor, and a guaranteed minimum income would go far to eliminating labor as a commodity. You would still get a job, and you would move between jobs, but there would be a floor underneath you. And of course, the most important thing, we have to change the laws on the right to organize. I have two children. They both, one is still a trade union organizer, the other one wasn't in the past. It's an extremely difficult road. I mean, in the United States and in Britain, Britain's a little bit better, but it's pretty bad. And so the way of winning a trade union vote, that whole procedure makes it extremely difficult and is becoming more difficult. That must be turned around. Okay, I'll just finish up by saying I'm in general not a great enthusiast for the politicians that rule the United States. But I would like to quote from Franklin Roosevelt's address to the U.S. Congress in 1938. To read it now, 73 years later, well, I will read it. He wrote, unhappy events have taught us two simple truths about the liberty of a democratic people. The first truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism. The second truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if its business system does not provide employment and produce and distribute goods in such a way as to sustain an acceptable standard of living. Among us today is a great concentration of private power without equal in the history of mankind. Well, I think that last sentence is even truer now than it was then. The advanced countries, especially the United States and the United Kingdom, reached the point in the 21st century in which private power is stronger than their democratic state. We're on the road. It gets darker every step, and pretty soon there'll still be enough light to see a little sign that says, beyond this point, there is no return. And for that reason, we should celebrate what's going on down in lower Manhattan, because maybe that will hold us back from encountering that sign for a while. Thank you.